The Flintstones and the Jetsons, Issue 4. After a predictable plot where the Great Kazoo puts Fred and Barney in the roles of their wives and almost nothing interesting is done with it, Spacely shows George a robot that looks like him. There's no reason George would say it looks just like him though. Spacely looks forward to having two Jetsons to boss around and yell at. So, he hates him so much he wanted to get the inventor to base the robot off him out of spite, even though he wouldn't want his worst employee to be represented by something tons of people would see. The professor who made it walks over to him and Spacely tells George to answer questions about himself so that he'd be able to program it properly. Why would Spacely want it to be programmed to act just like his least competent employee? This would only make sense if he already assumed George was going to lie to the professor that he loves his job in Spacely, who glares at him, making him do that. You'd think he'd want him to hate him if he knows he's mean to him. It'd be so predictable to have Spacely end up preferring the robot George because of this. After patting, Spacely sees the robot through a screen and is annoyed by him being so hardworking because he was supposed to be just like George. Of course, Spacely plans to fire George in favor of him. The professor says they should observe the robot in George's house in the hopes that he'd become like George. George gets jealous at seeing the newly painted robot hug Jane, with her loving affection so much that she's happy with the strange new robot hugging her. There's no way the family would think that's George. They're just calling him Dad and George because the robot told them to off screen. The family's impressed by a steak dinner and Robot George says he's gonna clean it up, and says he loves them all because they're wonderful. It's so nice of Elroy and Jane to say they love him and Elroy to hug him. Elroy looks forward to playing spaceball with him too. Then Jane, Elroy, and somehow Astro play instruments as the robot starts dancing with Jane. I hope this comic explains Astro too, because I can't stand him. The professor says he'll take the robot back, and later at work he plans to ask the robot how he felt about his experiences. He hates that life because his job is awful and he thinks Spacely's an idiot for no reason. George gets offended at the robot saying that the kids are annoying, the dog smells bad, and the wife is plain, when really only the wife being plain remark is false. He'd already know his kids are annoying. Eventually, Spacely sees a note on George's desk through a screen, and somehow the note gets enlarged with the text on it not being horribly pixelated. And it says that the robot's had it with humans and thinks he'll do better on his own somehow. Jane calls George and says that the whole family was worried about him for acting so different last night and they love him as he is. This comes out of nowhere too, because they clearly genuinely liked the robot George. Not to mention Jane would have to be as dim as a burnt out bulb to not know that was a robot. Why is she playing stupid? Spacely gives George a raise because he knows he'd never quit and gets thanked for promising to never try to replace him with a robot again. The Flintstones and the Jetsons, Issue 5. George looks forward to visiting a city hotel with Jane for fun. She pretends she doesn't remember what he said when they first got married, only to hug him and recite his corny line. And somehow their annoying daughter says she has cool parents. Elroy wonders what all the stuff George is packing is, and gets told it's dehydrated poi. A very obscure thing to reference. Jane reminds her kids to keep Astro away from the neighbors' dog, and to scramble the security codes at night. So now they do have a way to keep burglars out. George tells them to lie to Spacely if he calls that he's sick on Monday. Jane already programmed the meal-o-matic. Then she tells Jane not to have a party, so she thought of that, but was so desperate to go that she deluded herself into thinking she wouldn't throw one. Judy tells her friends with silly hairstyles that there's a party at her place, and one of them agrees to spread the word and gets thanked. With them all talking in annoying slang to try too hard to represent teens of the future. Elroy lampshades because he cares about her, that if her parents find out about the party, she'll get forbidden from TV, the phone, and video games for a year. It wouldn't be a year, that'd be abusive. She insults him as a spoiled sport, as I wonder why Elroy's being portrayed that way all of a sudden. He gets excited when she plans to invite the best skateboarder in the galaxy to her party. There's no reason it'd be called a straddle board and not a hoverboard. Elroy wants to get taught some tricks, and Judy isn't satisfied by Amira showing her in ridiculous costumes for no reason. There's no way they'd be considered normal, informal wear. Predictably, it turns out the poodle mentioned before is a girl Astro's got a crush on. Judy moves the photo, annoying him, and apologizes. Her friends never looked that silly in the show. It should have been explained that they're having a costume party. They all laugh at Elroy for liking hoverboarding, which is obviously forced. They're impressed by Judy's impractical outfit, which makes her look like a sci-fi villain, and she shows off a ring that tells her how a boy feels about her. It's such an annoying story. Judy has a band start playing, which would only make sense if either these are people she knows from school or she abused a credit card. Judy's thrilled to find out the master skateboarder's here. Somehow the ring just says it has insufficient data, and she offers him a drink. Elroy's upset because there's so many people there who aren't going to play with him. He somehow hears the teenagers complain that society's too soft because their great-grandparents did real work by telling machines what to do. He complains about them ignoring him, and Astro runs away, seeming to say noodles. He flatters the skateboarder by hugging him, and then conveniently the skateboarder figures out that he smells his dog. Then there's a cringeworthy page where Judy chases after him, ignoring that he doesn't like her, because she thinks he likes her because Astro is so close to him. George has to drive home early because he didn't know the customs agent would have a problem with the dehydrated boy. She shouldn't have needed Elroy to tell her that her ring's been picking up Astro. All Jane has to do is press a button to open up holes below everybody and send them directly into their cars. That's convenient. The house wasn't designed with them in mind. The air domes are still up, so they'd still get hurt landing on them. George gets mad at the skateboarder because Judy's embarrassed, and it's cathartic that he calls his friends hoodlums, even if it is an embarrassingly old man term. At least Elroy gets to ride on the guy's hoverboard, but George wouldn't be very likely to hold on to it for long. Mythbusters already confirmed that you could barely go a minute doing that with a building's ledge. It's so merciful of the story to not show Judy getting punished and yelled at by her parents for the party. And we can assume they did that off-screen. The Flintstones and the Jetsons, issue 6. I wonder why Jane would ever have flowers for George to water that look like that. They aren't pretty enough for her. Why is he in charge of this anyways and not Rosie? An alien lands a spaceship just outside of his house and leaves it, and goes into his house effortlessly since somehow no one keeps their doors locked in the future. Why is Elroy smiling at having to watch a commercial? How is he watching a commercial when he's watching TV in the future, instead of watching a streaming service? The TV returns to a nature show that he was interested in despite his age, but a panel later it's a commercial again. How is that possible? George wastes time asking Elroy if he's gonna watch TV all day, which intimidates him into agreeing to go out. And then the TV goes from a nature show to a soap opera. Inconveniently, it turns out the alien can shapeshift to look like Elroy, as there's stilted dialogue on the TV. It's unacceptable that he doesn't look exactly like Elroy. He saw him, and there's no excuse for George thinking it's Elroy. George gets apologized to by Elroy because he left the TV on, and when George sees the alien on the couch, he assumes he's been working too hard. Okay, hopefully this means he actually did notice that he looked wrong, and he's not just overreacting to the fact that he's on the couch when Elroy was just somewhere else. Conveniently, the TV shows the alien a monster, and somehow, even though he'd know it's just a TV show and he could turn it off, he runs away like a little kid and makes himself look like George. That TV show could have easily not been what was next. Jane calls the house to ask fake George what he wants for dinner. It should be explained that she assumes he looks like this because of an experiment of Elroy's gone wrong. Because her not noticing this would be insulting to our intelligence. And you can have comedy that doesn't do that. There's no reason he'd talk in such a ridiculous way. I know he's imitating the words he saw on TV, but someone would be lucky to get so many of the words of a foreign language to them right on the first try when trying to recall and pronounce them. Somehow she doesn't question the way he's talking right away. She wonders if he's trying to say he wants steak in a weird way. When he says sponge cakes and says he's worried about Fat Tony, she agrees to buy some. and says she's worried about George because she thinks he's been working too hard. So she thinks he's having a breakdown. This is a very casual and subdued reaction to seeing that from him. Then the call ends and the alien looks like Jane, except not. So again, I wish Judy explains that she blames Elroy for looking weird. But even then, she'd scream in fear at this, not keep chipper. She'd also ask why she's talking weirdly. She walks away instead of trying to investigate somehow, and the alien looks just like her but not. You'd think when she called Spacely Monster Spacely, he wouldn't say it was just crazy slang of a teenager. He'd also wonder why she was talking so weirdly. Then the alien disguised himself poorly as George, and you'd think Spacely would know it's not George. The alien runs out of the house screaming because he believed Jane that he's a monster and goes back to the spaceship to leave. All of this confusing, forced nonsense was worth it because Spacely gave George a vacation. He thought he really needed it, without explaining what conclusion he came to about why he looks like that. George says he's usually such a monster, but he'd know he's got a soft side because it was obvious that he's not as bad as he could be from the first episode, not to mention from a few issues ago. Not to mention how likely it is for him to hire him back. He seems like a jerk, but sometimes he's the nicest boss ever to the point of seeming unrealistic. The story ends with the alien and the other members of his species considering Spacely to be a monster and somehow wasting food making offerings to a giant boulder carving of his head, when they would know he's not a god. Why are they even trying to speak English when they suck at it and aren't around any humans? At least this would discourage their planet from invading. The Flintstones and the Jetsons, Issue 7. It starts with Judy and her friends lifting little barbells for exercise because they're in gym class, being ordered to by a coach bot, who's in front of the hovering volleyball team. A ball hits Judy in the head and someone apologizes to her and helps her up. Then it turns out that he's the teenage son of Mr. Cogswell. I don't remember that from the show. So this is another universe. It's always good to have a comic based on something choose creativity over being too faithful, because this gives it a lot more material for potential stories. George shouldn't be wasting time calling her out on dating Cody Cogswell, because he should know all of her relationships end in a second. Jane says she's busy trying to program dinner, because apparently Rosie's on vacation or doesn't exist. All Jane cares about is that Cody's nice, but George has a good reason to be scared of Spacely finding out, because Spacely's too much of a hothead. At work, Spacely complains to George because he knows what happened and tells him to find out more. Fortunately, instead of him punishing George and resenting him for what Judy did, he's smart enough to want to take advantage of this. He says he spent a lot spying on Cogswell and tells George to order Judy to spy for him. George asks Judy about Cogswell's business. Is of course told that they don't talk about that stuff, as a hologram of Judy's being projected, which ends up calling him pathetic from wanting her to spy on Cogswell. He'd be better off just putting an electronic bug in her outfit when she's dating him, which is easier said than done. Even then, it'd yield nothing about his business. I understand them wanting to take advantage of the opportunity, but they're too desperate to realize how obviously pointless this is. But even desperation wouldn't explain why they think teenagers are gonna talk about someone else's business, so this is another idiot's plot that won't happen. Of course, Cody refuses to ask Judy about her dad's business, and despite being bribed, he says he's no sneak. But then when his father talks to someone underwater while he's golfing, the person says he'll follow his sign on his dates for him. Spacely tells George to spy on them while he's getting a massage from robot hands hanging from the ceiling, which I hope happens in the real future along with a lot of other things, because that'd be far less uncomfortable than trusting some stranger to give a massage. This franchise makes corporate espionage look like it's normal. George is threatened with being fired if he doesn't comply with this, and he doesn't get Jane mad at him by telling him what he's up to. Predictably, Cody and Judy talk about what they went through with their parents without any drama involved, and are annoyed at the instant discovery of George spying on them. It's good that they notice him, because it's more realistic than the show's second episode. They decide to go to a club and pay to go in, and someone in front of the entrance asks George if he's a little old to be a teenager. George says a blatant lie. I took my time getting out of nursery school. And I assume he doesn't believe him but doesn't care about him. George ends up floating like everyone else at the dance club. George ends up bumping into Cogswell's spy, who Judy feels sorry for. For no reason, Judy assumes George came here to stop him and calls him the bravest. George gets sent through a drum, and the spy gets told he didn't pay for a ticket. George did, so he could have easily avoided being kicked out of the club. It's forced that Judy has so much faith in George. Him saying would give away that she's wrong. It should be obvious to Cody that George didn't mean to demonstrate physics by getting sent flying around. The next day, realistically, he has a headache. Elroy brings a friend home, and Jane cares enough to tell them to wash their hands. There's no reason Elroy would tell George that Corky is Cogswell's son after everything that happened. You can hear everything that goes on in the house from any room in it. George tells them to leave, and tells Jane to tell Spacely ran away to join the Martian Legion if he calls. So apparently wants a new job. The story ends with Elroy revealing that the last name Cogswell was just a coincidence, and his father owns a pet store. There's a lot of people in existence, so it would be possible that there'd be two families sharing a last name, even an unlikely one. This story has George get replaced with a robot who acts like the ideal worker and family man because he lied about himself with his boss right in front of him. It was nice to see his family be happy, but I still felt bad for George. But then a Deus Ex Machina forces the robot to hate his home life despite being programmed to love them, and somehow he thinks Jane isn't pretty. And he hates his job in Spacely too, despite being programmed to love them, and quits. But it makes no sense that he did, especially since even George doesn't hate his family this much, which wasn't even justified by Elroy being snarky and Judy being boy crazy in front of him. They're just the perfect kids. So the plot goes as you'd expect until the writer writes himself into a corner. And only happened because of the flimsy excuse that Spacely wanted a copy of his least favorite employee to yell at. I've seen a lot worse stories than this though. At least it was new. This story was awful, being about Judy throwing a party for annoying, grating friends who were exaggerated teenage stereotypes. It should have been called a costume party to justify the crazy outfits. Judy gets humiliated because of her ring in Astro when she should have known better, but it wasn't enough to make up for it. This confusing story that could have easily not happened was about an alien disguising himself as every real member of the Jetsons family, and our intelligence being insulted because somehow nobody realizes it can't possibly be the actual person and doesn't even explain why he thinks it is. And doesn't even scream and freak out, because somehow the alien sucks at disguises in the first place. But when you try to look past how forced the plot is that everybody's staying calm and nonchalant, and how it isn't really a Jetsons plot, it never stops being an interesting story. It's constantly captivating and creative, as you always want to see what the alien's gonna see next. Eventually, when he sees Spacely, he runs away screaming because he assumes he really is a monster thanks to Jane. Because I guess he's got a universal translator in his head. So Spacely thinks George needs a break, and all of this was worth it for giving him a vacation. The alien could have easily visited a different house, so good thing he didn't. This story is a mundane and probably cliched plot where Judy dates the son of Cogswell, and George gets sent to spy on them, because Spacely is desperate to find out about Cogswell's company. Even though he should know, he'd get no info about that out of their date. Cogswell's just as stupid, so he sends a spy after them too, and George crashes into him at the floating dance club Judy went to, getting the bouncers to notice him and realize he doesn't belong there because he somehow didn't pay for a ticket. It's very convenient as well that Judy and Cody think George only followed them there to deal with Cogswell's spy, when obviously he wouldn't have known the spy was going to follow them in the first place. And that Spacely could get George to do anything. Not to mention the spy only got kicked out of the club because somehow he thought not paying for a ticket would be a good idea. But I'll appreciate a happy outcome anyways.